Chapter 1. The Dinner Where They Decided Who I Was. The night my boyfriend's powerful family invited me to their mansion for dinner, his mother looked straight at me and said, I was nobody, just a poor woman trying to climb into their rich family, and everyone at the table believed her. But what they did not know was that I was one of the highest-paid dental reconstruction specialists in Seattle, earning more than the son she thought I was chasing. And while she was humiliating me in front of the entire family, her own mother was secretly recording every word in the room. And 2 weeks later, that recording would explode inside their foundation board meeting, trigger donor investigations, destroy a reputation that money had protected for decades, and turn the woman who mocked me at dinner into the center of the biggest social scandal their family had ever faced. And if you think the recording was the real revenge, wait until you hear what happened the moment the truth finally walked into that living room. My name is Marin, and this is the story of the family dinner that changed everything. My name is Dr. Alina Mercer. The night Ethan Hawthorne introduced me to his family, his mother decided I was a gold digger before I had even sat down at the table. I was 36 years old, living in Kirkland, Washington, and working at Cascade Restorative Dental Institute just outside Seattle. My job was rebuilding smiles other dentists said could not be saved. Patients flew in from 3 different states to sit in my chair. Some had spent years hiding their teeth before they found my clinic. But none of that mattered the night I walked into the Hawthorne family estate. Because the moment Victoria Hawthorne looked at me, she believed she already knew exactly who I was. Ethan and I had been together 8 months. He was 40, thoughtful, patient, and unlike most men I had dated, he never pushed for details about my career or my finances. He never asked how much money I made. He also never asked why a 6-year-old girl lived in my house. That little girl was Emma Cole. Most people assumed Emma was my daughter. I rarely corrected them. Explaining the truth always took longer than people expected. Emma was actually the daughter of my closest friend, Julia Cole. 2 years earlier, Julia went through a brutal divorce that triggered a severe mental health breakdown. Her parents lived in Idaho, and she needed space to recover away from Seattle. Before she left, she signed temporary guardianship papers so Emma could stay with me until things stabilized. Emma already had a bedroom in my house and a favorite spot at the kitchen table. She liked drawing pictures while I reviewed patient files at night. She liked blueberry pancakes on Saturday mornings. For both of us, the arrangement felt natural. Explaining it to strangers never did. And after 2021, I stopped feeling the need to justify my life to people who had already formed an opinion about me. That was the year my engagement ended. I had been engaged to a corporate attorney named Nathan Blake. At the beginning, he loved telling people his fiancé was a doctor. He loved the admiration it brought him. But as my practice grew and my income quietly surpassed his, resentment slowly turned into resentment. 6 months before the wedding, he sat across from me in our kitchen and admitted something I had already begun to suspect. My success made him feel small. 3 weeks later, he moved out. Since then, I learned something simple about people. When someone decides what kind of woman you are, the truth rarely changes their mind. Ethan's car rolled slowly through the gates of the Hawthorne estate that evening. The property sat on the edge of Hunts Point, overlooking Lake Washington. It was not just a large house, it was the kind of place that looked like it belonged in a magazine spread about generational wealth. Tall glass windows reflected the water. Carefully trimmed hedges lined the driveway. Soft golden lights glowed from inside the house like a private resort hidden behind trees. Emma held my hand as we walked toward the front door. "You nervous?" she asked quietly. I smiled down at her. "Not at all. Just dinner." The front door opened before we could knock. Victoria Hawthorne stood there waiting. She was 64, elegant, perfectly composed, the longtime chairwoman of the Hawthorne Family Foundation. The foundation funded hospitals, art programs, and half the charity galas in Seattle. She was used to being the most powerful person in every room she entered. Her eyes moved slowly from my shoes to the coat Emma was wearing, then finally settled on my face. The entire evaluation lasted about 3 seconds. That was all the time she needed. "You must be Alina," she said. Her voice was polite but distant, like someone greeting a delivery driver rather than a guest. "It is nice to meet you," I replied. Her gaze dropped to Emma. "And this must be your daughter." Emma squeezed my hand a little tighter. I smiled calmly. "Something like that." Victoria stepped aside and allowed us to enter. The dining room overlooked the lake through a wall of windows. A long walnut table stretched across the room under a chandelier of warm light. Crystal glasses and polished silverware reflected the candles placed carefully between every setting. Everything about the room was arranged to remind guests exactly how wealthy the Hawthorne family was. Ethan's younger sister, Claire, was already sitting at the table, scrolling through her phone. She was 32 and ran a lifestyle account online that mixed charity events with fashion posts. When she looked up at me, her eyes showed curiosity first, then something sharper. The kind of look people give when they believe they have just discovered someone they will talk about later. Dinner began with small talk about Seattle traffic and charity events. Victoria asked questions that sounded polite but carried quiet assumptions underneath them. "So, Alina," she said gently, "Ethan mentioned you work in dentistry." "Yes, I do." "At a clinic somewhere in Seattle." "That's right." She nodded slowly. "That must be fulfilling work, helping people take care of their teeth." Claire hid a faint smile behind her wine glass. Victoria continued as if she were simply clarifying a detail. "Are you an assistant there?" I smiled back at her without correcting the assumption. Not because I was embarrassed, but because sometimes allowing people to reveal their assumptions tells you far more than correcting them too quickly. After 10 minutes, something happened that changed the entire tone of the evening. Emma took a sip of water and suddenly coughed. The cough turned into a choke, and before I could reach her, she gagged slightly. A splash of water spilled across the Persian rug beneath the table. The room froze. Claire pushed her chair back quickly. "Oh my God!" Victoria stared at the rug as if someone had just damaged the priceless painting. Her eyes moved slowly from the rug to Emma, then finally settled on me. "Some people," she said calmly, "simply are not used to environments like this." Ethan stood up immediately. "Mom." But I was already kneeling beside Emma, wiping her face gently with a napkin. "You're okay, sweetheart," I said quietly. "Just breathe." Emma nodded, embarrassed but recovering. I helped her take another small sip of water, then turned toward Victoria. "I am very sorry about the rug." My voice stayed calm and steady. I did not argue. I did not defend myself. I did not correct any of the assumptions hanging in the air around that table. Because in that moment, something became perfectly clear to me. Victoria Hawthorne believed she had already identified exactly what kind of woman I was. A woman who had wandered into her son's life from outside their world. A woman who did not belong at that table. And the confidence in her expression told me she felt absolutely certain about that judgment. What Victoria Hawthorne did not realize that night was very simple. The woman she had just dismissed as ordinary was about to become the biggest problem her family had ever faced. Chapter 2. The Day She Tried to Ruin My Career. The next morning, I thought the tension from the dinner was already behind me. I assumed the worst part had been the awkward silence at that table and the quiet judgment in Victoria Hawthorne's eyes. I was wrong. By 7 in the morning, Seattle was still wrapped in pale gray light when I left the house. Emma was eating cereal at the kitchen counter, while I poured coffee into a travel mug. "You have surgery today?" she asked. "Yes," I said. "Big one." She smiled proudly, the way she always did when she thought about my work. "You fix people's smiles." Something like that. 20 minutes later, I was pulling into the parking garage of Cascade Restorative Dental Institute in Bellevue. The clinic occupied the entire top floor of a modern medical building overlooking the city. Most people thought dentistry meant routine cleanings and polite conversations about flossing. My work looked very different. Reconstruction cases, implant surgery, full arch restorations for patients who had spent years hiding their teeth. When I stepped into the surgical suite, my assistant, Lauren, was already organizing instruments. "Morning, Dr. Mercer," she said. "Morning, Lauren." She handed me a digital tablet with the imaging scans. "Our tech CEO just arrived. She looks nervous." That was not surprising. Andrea Sinclair had flown in from San Jose for this procedure. Years of stress and nighttime grinding had destroyed most of her upper teeth. Today, we were replacing the entire upper arch with implants and a custom restoration. The treatment alone cost more than $30,000. When I entered the consultation room, Andrea stood up quickly. "Dr. Mercer," she said, "I barely slept." "That is normal," I told her gently, "but today is the day everything changes." She gave a nervous laugh. "I have hidden my smile for almost 5 years. You will not need to do that anymore." The surgery lasted 2 hours. Precise placement, guided implants, careful reconstruction exactly as the digital planning predicted. When Andrea finally looked at her reflection with the temporary arch in place, she covered her mouth with both hands. Then tears started forming in her eyes. "I look normal again," she whispered. "You always looked normal," I said. "Now the mirror finally agrees." Moments like that reminded me why I loved my career. I was finishing notes in my office when Lauren appeared in the doorway. "Dr. Mercer, Dr. Harris asked if you could stop by his office." Dr. Benjamin Harris owned the clinic and rarely interrupted procedures unless something important had happened. His office faced the parking lot. He was sitting behind the desk with a message slip in his hand. "Alina," he said quietly, "close the door." I sat down across from him. "Everything all right?" He studied my face for a moment before speaking. "Do you know someone named Victoria Hawthorne?" The name sent a small chill through my chest. "Yes." He leaned back in his chair and sighed. "She called the clinic this morning." I kept my voice calm. "And what exactly did she want?" He slid the message slip across the desk. "She told the receptionist she had serious concerns about your qualifications. She implied that allowing someone with your level of experience to perform complex restorative work might be irresponsible." I looked down at the note. Then I looked back at him. "Irresponsible?" Dr. Harris shook his head slowly. "He also asked whether you were officially licensed to perform surgical procedures." I felt a wave of anger rise in my chest, but forced myself to stay calm. "What did you tell her?" He leaned forward slightly. "I told her that if Andrea Sinclair wanted the best restorative implant specialist in Washington State, she was already sitting in your chair." The tension in my shoulders eased slightly. "Thank you." He studied my expression carefully. "This woman sounds determined. She spoke as if she expected us to remove you from major cases immediately." I let out a quiet breath. "She is the mother of the man I'm dating." His eyebrows lifted slightly. "That explains the tone." For a moment, we sat in silence. Then he smiled faintly. "Just so we're clear, if anyone else calls questioning your credentials, I will personally send them your surgical outcomes and publications." That seems fair. I left his office with a very clear understanding of what had just happened. Victoria Hawthorne was not simply judging me. She was trying to damage my reputation. Across the lake in Hunts Point, she was already taking the next step. Victoria sat in the quiet library of the Hawthorne estate, speaking on the phone with a private investigator named Daniel Crow. "I want a full background investigation," she said calmly. "Financial records, education, previous relationships, everything." Crow asked a simple question. "What exactly are we trying to find?" Victoria looked out the tall window toward Lake Washington. "Something that proves she does not belong in this family." 3 days later, Crow returned with a thick report. Victoria opened the file, expecting to see proof that I was hiding something. Instead, she found something else. No debt, no criminal record, property ownership in Kirkland, doctorate degree from the University of Michigan School of Dentistry, specialized implant fellowships, published articles in surgical dentistry journals, a yearly income higher than many executives she knew. Victoria turned the pages slowly. Her expression grew colder with each document. "This cannot be right," she said quietly. Crow shrugged. Everything checks out. Victoria closed the file with irritation. Then she said the one thing that revealed exactly how her mind worked. Then she must be hiding something better. Meanwhile, another member of the Hawthorne family had decided to push the situation further. Claire Hawthorne was sitting at a rooftop restaurant in downtown Seattle, scrolling through photos on her phone. She selected one taken the previous evening. The image showed the iron gates of the Hawthorne estate. She uploaded the photo to her social media story with a short caption. Funny how some women suddenly appear when they discover a family like ours. Within minutes, her phone began buzzing with responses, friends asking questions, people guessing who she meant. Claire answered with vague replies and laughing comments. The story disappeared after 24 hours, but several people had already captured screenshots. Seattle's social circles were smaller than outsiders realized. Rumors traveled fast. 2 days later, I was finishing patient notes when Lauren stepped into my office, holding her phone. "Dr. Mercer," she said carefully, "you might want to see this." She handed me the phone. The screenshot showed the gates of the Hawthorne estate and the caption underneath. I read the line once, then again. Lauren watched my expression. "Do you know who posted it?" "Yes," I said quietly. "Unfortunately, I do." Outside my office window, the late afternoon sun reflected across the glass towers of Bellevue. For the first time since that dinner, I understood something clearly. Victoria Hawthorne was not just trying to push me away from her family. She was trying to destroy my reputation. And judging by how quickly the rumors were spreading across Seattle, she had only just begun. Chapter 3. The meeting they thought was private. 2 days after the rumors started spreading across Seattle, something happened that Victoria Hawthorne never expected. Someone in her own family decided to look at me without her assumptions. That person was Ethan's grandmother. Her name was Eleanor Hawthorne. She was 83 years old and lived in a cedar cottage near the edge of the Hawthorne property overlooking Lake Washington. While Victoria controlled the public image of the family through charity boards and social events, Eleanor lived quietly away from the main house. Late that afternoon, Ethan called while I was finishing paperwork at the clinic. "Are you free tonight?" "Mostly," I said. "Why?" "My grandmother wants to meet you." That surprised me. "Your grandmother?" "Yes." "And how much has she heard about me?" Ethan exhaled slowly. "Enough to be curious." The sun was setting when I drove through the Hawthorne estate gates again. The mansion stood glowing above the lake, its tall windows reflecting the water like a private hotel. But Ethan guided my car down a narrow path that led toward a smaller cottage closer to the shoreline. The cottage felt different from the main house. It was quiet, comfortable, almost peaceful. When we stepped inside, Eleanor Hawthorne sat near a wide window beside a porcelain teapot and 3 delicate cups. Her silver hair was tied back neatly. Despite her age, her eyes were sharp and observant. She studied me for several seconds before speaking. "So this is the woman my daughter believes is destroying the family." Ethan sighed. "Grandma." She waved her hand lightly. "Relax, Ethan. Sit down." I sat across from her while she poured tea. The room smelled faintly of cedar and chamomile. For a moment, none of us spoke. Then Eleanor looked directly at me. "You handled that dinner very calmly." I try to stay calm. Most people would have argued. I have learned arguing rarely changes someone's first impression. Her expression softened slightly. "That is true." She handed me a cup of tea. "My daughter believes she understands people the moment she meets them." Ethan leaned back in his chair. "Mom has always been like that." Eleanor gave a quiet, amused smile. "Victoria has spent her whole life surrounded by wealth and influence." She paused and looked at me carefully. "People who grow up in that world often believe they can read character instantly." Her eyes sharpened slightly. "They rarely expect to be wrong." I took a sip of tea. Across the room, Ethan was watching us both. Eleanor asked another question. "What exactly do you do at your clinic?" "I specialize in reconstructive dental surgery," I said, "implants and full arch restorations." Ethan turned toward me in surprise. "You never told me that." You never asked. He blinked slightly. I thought you mainly did cosmetic dentistry. Some of it, I said, but most of my patients come to me after other specialists tell them their case cannot be fixed. Eleanor watched this exchange quietly. Then she nodded slowly. You see, Ethan, this is exactly why your mother feels uncomfortable. Ethan frowned. What do you mean? She cannot place Alina into a category she understands. He leaned forward slightly. So you do not believe she is manipulating me? Eleanor almost laughed. If she wanted to manipulate you, she would have corrected your mother immediately at dinner. She looked at me again. But you stayed silent. Yes. Why? Because sometimes silence shows people exactly who they are. Eleanor leaned back and smiled faintly. I like that answer. I could not yet see the conflict forming inside the Hawthorne family, but the tension was already building beneath the surface. While we were sitting quietly in that small cottage near the lake, something very different was happening inside the main house. Victoria Hawthorne had gathered the family in the large library. The room was lined with dark wood shelves and framed photographs from charity galas and political events. Victoria stood near the fireplace holding a glass of wine. Claire Hawthorne sat on the leather sofa, scrolling through messages on her phone. Randall Hawthorne, Ethan's father, sat in an armchair reviewing financial reports. Victoria spoke first. That woman is becoming a problem. Claire looked up immediately. I told you she would. Randall barely lifted his eyes from the papers. What exactly has she done besides exist? Victoria turned toward him sharply. You saw how she behaved at dinner. Randall shrugged. I saw a child spill water. Claire rolled her eyes. You are missing the point. Victoria crossed her arms. She is positioning herself carefully. Claire leaned forward eagerly. She knew exactly how to act in front of Ethan. Randall closed the folder in his hands. You already hired someone to investigate her. Victoria nodded. And the report made no sense. Claire tilted her head. What do you mean? There's no debt, no scandal, no obvious reason she would want Ethan. Claire's frown grew colder. Exactly. Randall leaned back in his chair. Or maybe she is simply successful. Victoria ignored him. She is influencing Ethan. Claire nodded immediately. She definitely is. Randall sighed. He's 40 years old. Victoria began pacing slowly across the library floor. If we apply enough pressure, she'll leave. Claire smiled. And Ethan will thank us later. Victoria stopped walking and spoke quietly. She is nobody. None of them noticed the faint sound in the hallway outside the library door. Eleanor Hawthorne had returned to the main house a few minutes earlier to retrieve a book. As she approached the library, she heard voices inside. The door was slightly open. She paused. Eleanor listened longer than she intended. For several seconds, she stood perfectly still. Then she slowly reached into the pocket of her cardigan. Her phone appeared in her hand. She placed it quietly beside the table. The recording function activated silently. Inside the library, Claire laughed softly. I can't believe Ethan thinks she belongs here. Victoria's voice followed. She will never be part of this family. The phone resting outside the library door continued recording every word. Across the property, in the quiet cottage near the water, I finished the last of my tea. Eleanor watched me one more time. Then she spoke quietly. I have lived a long time, she said, and I have seen many family conflicts. Ethan was curious. What kind of conflicts? The kind where people decide the ending before the story even begins. She looked out toward the dark lake. The dangerous part is they're always convinced they're right. At that moment, I had no idea that a phone sitting outside a library door had just captured a conversation that would soon expose exactly what Victoria Hawthorne truly thought of me. But that recording had already shifting the balance in a conflict that was only getting started. Chapter 4. The moment the truth walked in. Something inside the Hawthorne family had already started breaking long before anyone admitted it. From the outside, everything still looked normal. The large house above the lake still hosted quiet dinners. Victoria Hawthorne still attended charity board meetings. Claire still posted carefully curated photos of the family life that everyone in Seattle admired. But something subtle had shifted. And 2 weeks after Eleanor recorded that conversation, Ethan asked me to meet him somewhere that had nothing to do with his family. The small coffee shop near Lake Union where we had first met. It was late afternoon when I arrived. The sky had turned the dull silver gray that usually meant rain would arrive soon. The same corner table by the window was open, and Ethan was already sitting there. He looked up when I walked in. His expression was calm but serious. I sat down across from him. For a few seconds, neither of us spoke. Finally, he folded his hands together on the table. "Marin, I need to ask you something." I nodded slowly. "Okay." His eyes stayed fixed on mine. "Are you hiding something from me?" The question did not surprise me. In fact, I had been expecting it for days. Rumors had been circulating around Seattle. Quiet questions from people who thought they understood my life, and quiet assumptions from people who clearly did not. Ethan leaned forward slightly. I asked because things were not adding up anymore. He looked frustrated, but not angry. "I kept hearing different versions of who you were." That was the moment I realized the silence I had maintained for months could not continue. I took a slow breath. "Yes." Ethan did not react immediately. He simply waited. So I told him the truth. I told him about my education first, the surgical reconstruction program I completed in Boston, the years of specialized training that followed. Then I explained the work I did now, full-arch dental reconstruction, complex trauma cases, patients who had been told by other surgeons that their faces could never be restored properly again. Ethan listened without interrupting. Then I told him about the clinic, the one I built in Seattle 5 years earlier, how it had grown faster than I expected, how surgeons from other states now referred their most difficult cases to my team. I told him about the investors who had approached me, the expansion plans already underway. Finally, I told him the part that most people cared about, the money, my income, the financial success that had quietly followed everything else. When I finished speaking, the cafe had grown quieter around us. Rain had begun falling outside. Water ran slowly down the window beside our table. Ethan leaned back in his chair. "You could have told me this months ago." "I know." He watched me carefully. "Why didn't you?" I stared at the coffee cup in my hands for a moment before answering. Because the truth was not simple. I lost someone once because of it. Ethan frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" "There was someone before you." I spoke quietly. He said he admired my ambition, but when my career started moving faster than his, something changed. Ethan remained silent. He told me my success made him feel smaller. The memory still carried a dull weight inside my chest. So this time I needed to know something first. Ethan looked at me steadily. "What?" "I needed to know whether you cared about me." I paused. "Or about the version of me you imagined." For several seconds, Ethan said nothing. The rain outside had grown heavier. Cars passed slowly along the wet street. For a moment, I believed I had just made the same mistake again. Then Ethan shook his head slowly. "I wish you had trusted me sooner." My stomach tightened. But he continued. "Not because of the money." He leaned forward slightly. "But because you thought I was the kind of man who would judge you for it." Relief moved through me so suddenly it almost felt unreal. "I'm sorry." Ethan reached across the table and took my hand. His voice softened. "I understand why you did it." He smiled faintly. "But I have to admit something." "What?" "I'm a little impressed." I blinked. "Impressed?" "You sat through dinner with my mother while she assumed you were a struggling dentist." He shook his head slightly. "And you never corrected her." I laughed quietly. I have learned silence can be very educational. Ethan looked out the window at the rain, then back at me. "There is something else." "What?" "My mother needs to hear the truth." The words made my stomach tighten again. "You want to tell her?" "Yes." "When?" "Tonight." 2 hours later, we drove through the Hawthorne Estate gates again. The mansion stood glowing above Lake Washington. Inside the main living room, Victoria Hawthorne sat on the long, cream-colored sofa, reviewing documents from one of her foundation boards. When we walked in, she looked up. Her eyes moved first to Ethan, then to me. Her expression cooled slightly. I wasn't expecting company tonight. Ethan closed the door behind us. "We need to talk." Victoria placed the documents on the table beside her. "About what?" Ethan stepped forward. "About Marin." Victoria's gaze sharpened. "I'm listening." Ethan spoke calmly. "Marin is one of the leading dental reconstruction specialists in Seattle." Victoria blinked once, clearly confused. Ethan continued. "Her clinic handles some of the most complex surgical restorations in the region. Other surgeons refer cases to her. She also owns the clinic." Victoria looked at me again, trying to process what she was hearing. Then Ethan added the final piece quietly. "Her income is higher than mine." For a moment, Victoria Hawthorne simply spluttered. It was as if someone had suddenly changed the rules of a conversation she believed she controlled. Before she could respond, another voice entered the room. I thought this might be the right time. Eleanor Hawthorne stepped calmly into the living room, holding her phone. Victoria turned sharply. "Mother?" Eleanor walked toward the center of the room. "I believe everyone should hear something." Victoria's voice turned sharp. "What do you mean?" Eleanor tapped the screen. Victoria's voice filled the room from the phone speaker. Cold, clear, unmistakable. "She is nobody." Claire's voice followed. "Women like her always try to climb into families like ours." Then Victoria again. "If we pressure her enough, she'll leave." The recording stopped. The room fell completely silent. Victoria opened her mouth as if to respond, but no words came out. For the first time since I had met her, Victoria Hawthorne was no longer the person controlling the room. Chapter 5. The kind of karma that money cannot stop. The silence in the living room did not break immediately after the recording stopped. For several seconds, no one moved. Richard Langford slowly lowered himself back into the armchair near the fireplace, his eyes still fixed on his wife. Victoria Langford stood in the center of the room as if the ground beneath her had shifted. The certainty she carried every day had disappeared. Richard finally spoke. "Victoria." His voice was quiet but steady. "I warned you about deciding who people are before you actually listen to them." Victoria turned toward him, her expression tightening, but there was nothing she could say that would erase what everyone had just heard. Eleanor rested her phone gently on the coffee table. "I did not play that recording to humiliate anyone," she said calmly. "I played it because sometimes truth deserves witnesses." Ethan remained beside me, his hand lightly touching my back. I could feel the tension leaving the room slowly, like air escaping from something that had been held too tight for too long. Victoria straightened her jacket and walked toward the door without another word. For the first time since I had met the Langford family, the house felt strangely quiet. But the real consequences of that moment did not happen inside the living room. They began outside it. Eleanor had not meant to spread the recording. She simply mentioned the situation to two friends from her charity committee the following afternoon. In Seattle's philanthropic circles, information moved quickly, especially when it involved someone as well-known as Victoria Langford. Within days, a story began circulating quietly among board members and donors. The president of the Langford Community Foundation had publicly dismissed a respected medical specialist simply because she believed the woman came from a lesser background. In a city where reputation carried enormous weight, that story did not sit well. During a fundraising luncheon later that week, one longtime donor approached Richard privately. "I heard something unusual about your foundation president." Richard did not pretend he did not understand the question. 2 days later, another donor postponed a large contribution that had been scheduled for the following quarter. No one accused Victoria publicly, but the message was clear. Respect mattered, and people who built charities on public goodwill were expected to show it. Inside the Langford family, the tension grew impossible to ignore. Victoria's daughter Madison noticed the shift almost immediately. Her social media page had always been filled with photos from charity galas, foundation events, and carefully staged family moments. But the comments began changing. People repeating parts of the story, people asking whether the recording was real. Within 3 days, Madison quietly disabled her public account. For the first time in years, the Langford name was no longer untouchable. One morning, I arrived at the Langford house to meet Ethan before work. Richard was already seated at the kitchen table reading through several emails. Victoria sat across from him, unusually silent. Richard placed the tablet down. "This situation could have been avoided." Victoria said nothing. Richard continued, "You decided she was a threat before you even spoke with her." Victoria finally looked up. Her voice was quieter than I had ever heard it. "I thought I was protecting our family." Richard sighed. "Sometimes protection looks a lot like arrogance." No one in the room disagreed. A few weeks later, another part of the story reached its natural ending. Lauren Carter returned to Seattle briefly to finalize the last legal details of her divorce. She stopped by the clinic before leaving. Her daughter Sophie waited beside her near the front desk. The moment Sophie saw me, she ran forward and wrapped her arms around me tightly. "Thank you for helping my mom," she said. Lauren smiled softly. "You helped more than you realize." Sophie and Lauren left Seattle that afternoon to move to Oregon, where Lauren's parents had offered them a new start. Watching them drive away felt like the final closing chapter of something that had begun months earlier. The Langford house grew quieter after that. Victoria still attended certain charity functions, but her presence carried less authority than it once had. People were polite, but the effortless admiration she once commanded had faded. Reputation in a city like Seattle rarely collapses overnight, but once doubt appears, it rarely disappears completely. Winter arrived slowly that year. One evening, Ethan and I walked along the edge of Lake Washington. The water stretched across the horizon under a pale gray sky, perfectly still except for small ripples from the wind. For a while, we walked in silence. Finally, Ethan stopped near the railing and looked out across the lake. "I want you to understand something," he said quietly. I turned toward him. "What?" "I never fell in love with your career." I smiled faintly. "I know." Ethan shook his head. "No. I mean, I respect what you built, but that was never the reason." He looked at me carefully. "I fell in love with the way you handled everything. The dinner, the rumors, my family. You never tried to fight them. You just stayed exactly who you were." The lake moved quietly beneath the winter sky. For years, I had believed that success often made relationships fragile, that the more visible your accomplishments became, the more likely they were to create distance. But standing there beside Ethan, I realized something else was possible. The right people were not threatened by strength. They recognized it, they respected it, and they stood beside it without asking you to become smaller. I looked out toward the distant lights of Seattle. Somewhere inside that city, Victoria Langford was probably still trying to understand how everything unfolded so quickly. And perhaps that was the lesson she would remember longest. Sometimes the greatest mistake a person can make is not hatred. It is underestimating someone the moment they walk into the room. Because when you decide who someone is before you know them, you also decide what you will never see. Ethan gently squeezed my hand. You stayed at that dinner table when most people would have left. I smiled slightly. I wanted to know how the story ended. The lake stretched quietly before us, and now that the ending had finally arrived, I realized something unexpected. Justice rarely arrives with loud victories. Sometimes it appears in a quieter form, the moment when the truth becomes impossible to ignore. If you had been sitting at that dinner table the night everything started, what would you have done? Would you have stood up and walked away? Or would you have stayed long enough to prove they were wrong? And if stories like this remind you that patience and self-respect can sometimes be the strongest kind of revenge, stay with us, because there are many more stories waiting to be told.